There are lots of reasons to consider working in an international school. I've been in an international school environment for the last 10 years, and I've really enjoyed it. Now, that's not to say that every moment has been a joy. It's been full of challenges, and I've really had to take the ups with the down, the rough with the smooth. But overall, I'd certainly recommend that you seriously consider taking the plunge and perhaps applying for and maybe accepting a job in the international sector. Before doing so, though, there's some things you really need to consider. I would advise that you don't make a move overseas into an international school based upon the push factors. There are several reasons why you might think it's got to be better over there than it is over here, regardless of what country you're currently in. It's not always the case that the grass is greener on the other side, but it often is. So you've really got to think about it. Our first piece of advice I give is not to make a move to another country based upon the fact that you're dissatisfied with your life in your own country. If you're dissatisfied with life in your own country, you really need to be quite introspective. You need to think about, well, why is it that I'm unhappy, or why don't I feel fulfilled? And will moving overseas change that? And in some cases it will. But in other cases it could lead to a life of frustration and loneliness because you're making a leap into the dark. So you really need to consider why it is that you consider moving overseas. I think many people, for very different reasons, want to get away from their own country, maybe for political reasons or social and economic reasons. And that can apply to people looking to the international sector currently working in the developing world, but also in countries like the United Kingdom and the United States, where a lot of people in the world of education are deeply unhappy with the current administrations, their current governments, and maybe think it's a better option just to get away for a while. Wait until there's a change of regime or a change of government. But again, things may not change or may not change the way you want them to. And if you think that you're going to go back to your country of origin, is a break, if that's what it is, going to help you or just lead to deeper frustrations when you do go back? Many people also make the move overseas to escape something. It could be a broken relationship, divorce, or perhaps even the loss of a loved one. And people think, well, if I go overseas, I can reinvent myself and have a new life. And again, it works for some people, but for other people, it's the same life, just a different location, and perhaps a location where you don't have the support network of family and friends. So you need to really think deeply. Do I really want to make the move? Now, probably a lot of people making the move to the international sector are going to be in their 20s or early 30s, and such considerations may not be as prevalent. But if you're a little bit older, it's certainly worth thinking it through. And some people do reinvent themselves and get a new lease of life by working in the international sector. You can be a different person. No one's going to know you. You can adapt your personality to your new environment. You make new friends, and you have a different way of life. So it's not necessarily a bad thing. So when you're thinking about the international sector, there's a number of things to consider when you start looking at the advertisements. I've previously done some podcasting and YouTube videos reviewing a lot of the websites which are out there with recruitment agencies and their comparative strengths and weaknesses. And you might want to take a look at those or listen to my podcasts so that you can weigh up who may be the most legitimate of the recruiting organizations. Some of them are much better than others, and some of them will only work with schools with an established track record. Now, there are new schools which are worth checking out, but there's always an element of risk. But you can never negate the risk if you're making a move into the unknown. Chances are, unless you're going for a job at a very senior level, you're going to be interviewed on Zoom or Skype. You'll probably never actually visit the school before you arrive to take up your duties. If you do have the opportunity to visit the school and to go and see what it's really like, I'd highly recommend it. But if it's on the other side of the world and you're in full employment, that may be more difficult than it sounds. So when you're making your decision about the school where you would go to, depending on your personal situation, there's various things you might consider. It may be that you want to work in a particular type of school with a particular type of curriculum model. You may be coming from the United Kingdom or have experience of English national curriculum, for example, so you may be looking for a British school overseas. And in that case, you'll have the choice of schools all around the world. Similarly, if you're an American and you want to stay working in an American-style international school, every country will have an American school overseas, and there'll be other schools with American standards-based curriculum models, and at the top end offering AP. Those schools may be what you want, so again, the world is your oyster. Again, Cambridge schools, where English national curriculum underpins the model of teaching and learning, are everywhere. There's very few countries where you won't find a Cambridge school, and similarly with the IB. So there's a lot of choice in terms of the educational model. But will you be more driven by that, or perhaps you have a particular place or region you want to go? I think with younger people, Asia is incredibly popular. A lot of people will consider China, Japan, South Korea, because the salaries tend to be better if you're coming to the East. But in terms of quality of life, a lot of young people will think about Thailand, Vietnam, Cambodia, Laos, maybe Malaysia, countries where there's beach life and more of a kind of party atmosphere where you can enjoy the facilities in your downtime or maybe at your weekends. In terms of jump-off places for vacations or holidays, anywhere in Asia is always going to be an easy access of the beach. I'm in Shanghai. It's 5 hours down to Malaysia or Singapore, and anywhere else is nearer. Now, at this time, 2020, these factors may not be the biggest pull factors. With a world affected by COVID-19, you may not have the travel opportunities that existed a short time ago. So if moving to an international school based upon opportunity for travel is a key factor, it may be worth reconsidering because you may be restricted. Albeit in China, for example, where I'm working currently, China is a vast country in its own right, 1.5 billion people, and a huge landmass. And a lot of my colleagues have travelled extensively within China in a recent holiday time because they couldn't go anywhere else, and they've loved it. They've really kind of got that cultural appreciation for the country we live in. So you can still travel, but you need to recognise it may be in the country where you take the job. Similarly, whether you'd want to go to a city or a rural area, maybe somewhere closer to the sea, all these will be big factors. I've got a young family and I'm in Shanghai, and although I enjoy my work and we do enjoy living in Shanghai, the downside is it is a concrete jungle. My children are now toddlers, and we recognise they don't have a lot of space to play. So if and when I make the next move, I would seriously consider somewhere where I'm more likely to have a house with a garden, or a school with lots of acres of land and room where my children can play. And one of the beauties of such a school is that the facilities outside of school hours are often available to families, even in the boarding situation. And that's another thing to consider. A lot of international schools are boarding schools or a hybrid of boarding and day schools. So what would be your preference? I've worked in boarding schools where I've had to do extended hours into an evening, but then most schools will give you time in lieu. So although one week you may do an extended day, the next week you may finish earlier and be able to enjoy a more active social life, which is important. And I think is one of the great pull factors that teachers in many countries, I know in the UK where I'm from, often feel that there isn't a good work-life balance, and the international sector may offer a much better experience. And I think they're right to a large degree, but it really does depend on the school you go to, the organisation that you work for. And so you need to do a lot of background research. Some of the bigger chains have reputations for working their people tirelessly. But the other side of the coin is that you may be able to avail some tremendous professional development opportunities for working for a large organisation where they benefit from the economies of scale, can bring in outside speakers or people to lead workshops, and have a vast network of their own people to draw upon for professional development. So it's worth considering the big chains, but have a look at what people say about them. And it's also worth considering some of the smaller rural schools for a different way of life. If you really want to experience what life is like in a country, then don't go to a city, go to a smaller town or to a rural area, perhaps a boarding school in a remote area. Now, before working in China, I've worked extensively in sub-Saharan Africa, and one of the beauties of sub-Saharan Africa is it's very easy to connect with the people and with the culture, because even if you're in a city, they're not as vast as one of the Asian cities or European cities. So anyway, I found personally it was much easier to connect with people, and I had a lot of friends in Malawi and Zambia and Nigeria. So yeah, horses for courses, as they say. What suits you? But really think about it before you accept a job, because it may be the country you want to go to, but the wrong location within that country. There are websites out there which will help you make the decision. It's also worth checking the Facebook page, the Google reviews of the schools, and any other review website that you find. International Schools Review is definitely worth checking, but always read their reviews with a pinch of salt. It's unlikely that anyone other than a disgruntled teacher or administrator is going to pay, I think it's $30, to sign up for International Schools Review, ISR as it's commonly known, and unless they're disgruntled. And thus, most of the reviews you read are from disgruntled teachers. So if it's a long-established school and there aren't many reports critical of the school, then you'll know that it probably is okay. If you read many, many reports of disgruntled schools which are critical of the owners, the administration, then maybe there's some truth in what's been said. So it's certainly worth checking out. I've said the grass isn't always greener on the other side, but for many teachers around the world, you can command a better salary in the international sector than what you may be paid in your own country. Now, the cash cows are definitely countries like China, perhaps Japan and Singapore and South Korea in Asia. and much of the Middle East, Dubai, Oman, Abu Dhabi are hugely popular destinations. Check out the terms and conditions of such jobs. Some are tax-free. Some you will pay local taxation. For example, in China, local taxation isn't particularly high compared to most European or North American countries. So in terms of tax rate, you do take home more than you might as a proportion of your salary. But the salary is only one aspect of your overall package. You need to be very aware of the terms and conditions, what holiday entitlement you have, what hours you will typically be working, whether or not your weekends will be your own or whether you're expected to work some or all, and other things like housing. Usually housing is provided in the international sector. And if the higher up the chain of command you are, the better the housing you will get. And you can get some beautiful accommodation if you're a principal. If you're a main scale teacher, and particularly a young teacher, with your first job, you may end up in a small flat, and it may be perfectly adequate, but it's worth looking into it. Talk to teachers who already work in that school or have worked in that school and find out what their experiences are. If you have to find your own accommodation, you'll get an allowance, but then check out websites in advance to see really what the cost of living is and what the rental market is like in the particular location you'll be moving to. Insurance is another big thing, again depending on where you're going. If you're going to a developing nation, which I think is seriously worth considering for a really enriching experience, then you may get a good insurance package, but what will your access be to healthcare in reality? Now, when I worked in sub-Saharan Africa, in Zambia, Malawi, one of the nice elements of the insurance package was in that emergency situation, there was a proviso where you could be flown out to South Africa or to Europe in the case of an emergency where you needed serious treatment. And you are covered by your insurance. That's for me as someone who is British, but for Americans there's often exemptions. Even the insurance I have now in China, my American colleagues are exempt from using their insurance in their own country, albeit they can use it anywhere else in the world. So that's worth considering. And if you've got a family, are your family covered by your insurance? If not, how expensive is insurance in the country that you may be going to? And whilst you're thinking of family, to what extent will your employer pay their expenses, their flights, their visas, and any other costs that you'll incur in relocation? All worth checking out, as is relocation expenses. Also, the gratuity that you'll receive at the end of the contract. Gratuities are the norm in the international sector, and they tend to range between 10% and 20% of what you earn across 2 years, in some cases 3 years, and it's nearly always taxable except if you've got a tax-free package. The gratuity is like the icing on the cake. I mean, the fact that you can maybe walk away with £10,000, £20,000, $25,000 at the end of a 2-year contract, which is money that's in the bank, is one of the lovely draws in terms of the terms and conditions of the international sector. Also be aware of taxation in your country of origin. In the UK, there's no requirement to pay tax at home, but if you're American and you want to avail of the facilities that you'd expect as an American, then there may be a requirement for you to pay tax twice. Now, most countries that's not the case, so just be aware of it if you're in the United States. I'm not so sure about Canada. It may be wise to pay national insurance or whatever the equivalent is in your own country, where you would have then entitlement to something like a national health service upon return, and also to be eligible for a state pension in your country of origin. If you're only out for a couple of years and you go back to your country of origin, it's probably not so prevalent for you. But if you leave your country for a number of years, but do one day see yourself going back there, even to retire, it's worth making contributions to national insurance so you have that additional safety net. Now, things to look out for if you move to the international sector is culture shock, for starters. No matter how seasoned a traveller you are, and how much you have holidayed or even taken a year out and backpacked around the world, none of that really prepares you for living in a different country where people may speak a different language and have a different way of life. And culture shock hits people in different ways. Some people will take to a new culture like a duck to water and it barely affects them. But other people, including young people, do take time to readjust. And be prepared to be homesick. You're going to be a long way from your family and friends. Luckily, we live in an era of FaceTime and other social media, so home is never that far away to some degree. It's a lot better than the era of Nokia 3310. I know that from experience. Don't see any country or any school through rose-tinted spectacles. Everywhere has its own challenges. Everywhere has its own joys. So really kind of just be ready to take whatever comes. Opportunities for travel, as I've alluded to, are definitely a huge pull factor for many and perfectly legitimate. I've availed of travel opportunities across sub-Saharan Africa and across particularly Southern Asia, Southeast Asia. So even in an administrative position, I've had ample opportunities to travel, even with my young family, and that is definitely one of the perks of living internationally. But at the time that I am recording this, it's probably not one of the major pull factors until the world reverts to something like the previous normal. That's the term we want to use. You will find, even if you have challenges, that the whole experience of working in an international school in a country other than your own will be personally enriching. You will grow, you will develop, you will become more culturally aware, you'll become more internationally minded. You'll work with people from all around the world. You'll work with people from the host country. And many international schools, half the staff, or approximately half, will come from the home country. So it's a great opportunity to befriend your colleagues and to find out about their culture. If you're fortunate and you strike up a really strong friendship, then you may get the opportunity to visit their home. And if you're in an urban environment, you'll find that many of your colleagues will come from other parts of the country, and you'll be able to go to visit them in their town or their village and really kind of see how people live in that country. There's some amazing architecture, heritage, museums, just culturally enriching experiences wherever you might think of going. It's like you're living in a world of history you may have only read about. So whichever country in the world you may consider, that is going to be the case. Now, I've alluded to curriculum models, and that's an important consideration. It's not that you can't go to work in a school where you're not familiar with the curriculum model. And for many people leaving their own country where they've worked in the domestic education system, it may be they have no IB experience. And that's quite normal for IB schools to hire people straight out of their country of origin. So, I've worked in a school with American standards-based education as curriculum director, and I taught myself with some help from my head of school and how that system worked. And within a few months, I was incredibly au fait with the system. So it's a challenge, but it's not something you can't overcome. And subsequently, you really do grow as an educator. Your knowledge and understanding of other systems is priceless. It's a tremendous professional development in itself. Depending what type of school you go to, if you go to an American school overseas or a British school, for example, and you're American or British, you'll just be able to seamlessly blend in with the curriculum models. But if you go to the Middle East or to China or other parts of the Far East, then you may find that there are statutory obligations in international education schools which serve local families, where there'll be a hybrid of the local national curriculum with perhaps Cambridge or middle years or PYP curriculum models or APC or the like. So it's just fascinating. I mean, I've loved working with the Chinese national curriculum. You know, as an administrator with a key eye for curriculum, it's been enriching to work alongside Chinese colleagues to read translated versions of the documents and then try to map English national curriculum against Chinese national curriculum so that we can prepare our students for IGCSE and A-level whilst meeting our statutory requirements. It's just fascinating. But yeah, I'm an education geek, so I really enjoy that sort of thing. Again, beware of the fly-by-night operations. Now, as much as I've loved my time in the international sector, I will admit that I was tricked and fell for it. And you may laugh because, yeah, I went to Nigeria and had a bad experience in many ways. Now, I don't want to stereotype. Nigerians are wonderful people, and I loved the people I worked with. But I worked for a corrupt owner of a school who was only interested in making a lot of money and really didn't have a vision for education. Now, when I spoke to her during an interview, she seemed like she was a visionary, but actually on the ground it was a different story. And also I arrived and I was told that 50% of my salary would be paid in sterling and 50% in naira, the local currency in Nigeria. But that wasn't the reality which I encountered. I arrived to lots of stories about why they couldn't pay me so much in sterling. I also was put into luxury accommodation according to the advert because I was head of school. And it was a nice apartment externally, and it was nicely fitted. But we didn't have electricity for 12 hours of the day. There was a generator, but it wasn't always turned on. And I had, at that time, a young child. My son wasn't even 2. And my son had to live in that environment. So we had to then ourselves buy an inverter so we could generate our own electricity during the power outages. And obviously cost. And you can only power a certain amount of appliances using a small inverter anyway. And in that environment, it had to be a fan and a TV. But it's so hot in some countries, you will need some kind of fan or air conditioning could be the norm. So really kind of be wary. I was naive enough to be tricked. And I think I'm pretty worldwide, and I worked in a number of different countries before then. But, yeah, that one didn't work out very well, and I had to leave after 1 year of my contract. One of the joys of the international sector, and I think you'll find wherever you might go, is that the kids tend to be a joy. You tend to work with kids who, for whatever reason, if it's the top end and the parents are paying incredibly high fees, down to the international schools who are serving middle class or maybe better paid working class parents, the kids tend to be a joy. You don't really encounter the same sorts of discipline issues as you might in your country of origin if it is one of the European countries, for example. I've certainly found that the children have been incredibly well behaved with a real desire to learn. And that'll be the same that I found by and large in France, in Malawi, in Zambia, in Botswana, Nigeria, and now in China. So kids in international schools do tend to be quite well focused. There will be some who've got very, very rich parents and thus don't have the work ethic you would want. But they're not necessarily going to be badly behaved. You just need to find ways to motivate them. So usually the kids are a joy. Going back to legitimacy of contract, again, depending where you go, your contract may look secure on paper, but you will be a foreigner in someone else's land. And the rights that you will have won't be the same rights as you'd expect in your own country. And in some cases, people could be harshly treated, depending on where you are. And you don't really have many rights of appeal if you lose your job or your contractual obligations aren't met. So you really are, to a large extent, you're in the hands of your employer. And you really need to know that you're working for someone who is trustworthy. Transport can be a big issue. I've worked in Paris and Shanghai, and I worked in London when I worked in the UK. And I didn't need a car. But I worked in Zambia, Malawi, Botswana, and Nigeria. I eminently needed a car. And that's obviously a cost. And it may be that you car share with a colleague, or you find other ways of transport. It's certainly worth travelling with the locals. Sub-Saharan Africa tends to be on something like a minibus. That's a great way to kind of really get to know what the place is like. But if you want to be able to move around at antisocial hours and things like that, then you probably need your own car. And you probably need a good car in good condition, because some of the roads in the developing nations aren't as fit for driving as you might be used to in your own country. Your social life can be wonderful. Cities are obvious. There's always going to be a vibrancy about a city. Now, I'm so lucky to have lived in London, Paris, and Shanghai. I've really enjoyed the best restaurants, the nicest bars and pubs that you could find in different sorts of ways depending on the country. But you'll find your own social life wherever you end up. When I was in Sub-Saharan Africa, a lot of the social life for many foreigners, I never use the term expats in any of my videos or podcasts. I just find it an offensive term. Many of the foreigners will have their own networks where they mix with other foreigners. And you tend to find as well that it's not exclusive to foreigners, that you get a network of people who work together. So you will socialise by and large with people you work with, at least initially. But having said that, my network's extended after the first 6 months or so of working in a couple of the countries, particularly in Sub-Saharan Africa. I built my own network of friends who weren't necessarily people I worked with, and really also in the local community. So my best friends were Malawians or Zambians. So I felt really kind of privileged, and it was a great way to kind of really get to know their country better. But your social life is what you make it. Even if you go to a smaller city or town, you'll find there's sports facilities, and there'll always be places to socialise. And many foreigners in such environments will make their own entertainment. Now, you may be living on a campus if you go to a boarding school, and often, particularly if it's remote, that involves creating your own social environment. So people can be imagining about they do that. Life in a bubble can be pretty tricky. It's a funny phrase to use at this time, but it can be like living in a bubble, because if you live on a campus, you're just surrounded by the people you work with, and if it's a boarding environment, then So there's no escaping the students, but I think hopefully you know that's not meant in a negative way. It's hit and miss in the international sector when it comes to promotion prospects. Sometimes you find the principals and heads now, I would say, are more likely to be over promoted than they might be in the country where you originally come from. You'll find some guys, nearly always guys, occasionally women, who would certainly get nowhere near a principalship if they were in the United Kingdom, and the United States or Canada or Australia, for example. But they're in these positions of power because they've remained in the same employment for a number of years. They're seen as loyal, and particularly in Asia, loyalty is such a big factor that you find these over-promoted people. And sometimes the over-promoted people will look to people they know and trust, who they can put around them because they'll protect them, and they each protect their own self-interest. So sometimes you find that the management structures aren't that efficient. Now, if you're a teacher who isn't particularly committed, that can be a good thing. But if you're diligent and committed, as the overwhelming majority of teachers in the world are, then you may find it a frustration. Nepotism doesn't just extend to politics. Turnover of staff is quite high in the international sector. It's rare for people to stay beyond 2 contracts on the whole. 4 years tends to be the maximum, and a lot of younger teachers often will move on after 2 years. Be careful not to be falling into the trap of being perceived as just being on the international school carousel, because when you're ready to jump off it, maybe the next job where you really want to kind of put some roots down for a while may be harder to find in a school with great credibility. But at the same time, it does show a load of flexibility and adaptability. And I think in the modern world, those things are far more recognised as positive than they may have been even a decade ago. But just be wary of appearing to be flaky. And that's probably more something for people working at administrative level. If you're a school leader, then you probably want to at least cut your teeth in a 3 or 4 year spell in one school before you start moving around too frequently. Having said that, the average principal stays 2-3 years, according to what I've read in the international sector. So it's not always a bad thing to move around, work with different people. It helps you to be a lifelong learner. You'll maybe find that there's language barriers. Some languages are pretty hard to learn. I've been working on my Chinese, but I'm not great linguistically anyway. But it's a tough language. Most of my foreign colleagues struggle to get to the stage where you can properly converse. There are exceptions. And if you're working in a big city like Beijing, Shanghai, Guangzhou, Shenzhen, you'll find that English is widely spoken. Once you move to the 2nd and 3rd tier cities or other parts of the country, you'll find that English is much less frequently spoken. Another great plug for sub-Saharan Africa: if you're an English or French speaker, chances are you'll be able to use your mother tongue as frequently as you need to. Bear in mind that you'll be a long way from home, and that could be great, but in the case of an emergency, you may struggle to get home, and it could be that you miss out on the joys of the rites of passage of seeing close friends marry, going to baptisms, bar mitzvahs, or other religious services, maybe even being able to bury a loved one. I unfortunately missed out on my godfather's burial and also my grandmother. But you need to be aware of it. It's part of what you sign up for, and particularly when you work as far away from your home country as, say, working in the Far East if you're European. When I worked in France, it wasn't such an issue to be able to take a few days off and I'd be back. It was easy. But in COVID-19 times and the world beyond this, travel is going to be even more difficult. So bear in mind, if you move far away from home, you can't expect to be going home that frequently. So if you're a home bird and you're British, maybe work in France or Belgium or the Netherlands, or if you're an American, maybe work out of state. Canada, Mexico, maybe. At least you can get over the wall, you can fly. So really, that kind of sums up what I've got to say in this podcast. I wholeheartedly recommend the international sector. I've loved the city life in Paris, and I love the city life in Shanghai. I've really enjoyed all of my experiences, from these city experiences to working in the smaller city, which would be a town in any other context, Blantyre in Malawi. Absolutely wonderful time there. Worked in a wonderful school with wonderful people. There were challenges, but I loved it. I loved working in Zambia. I also worked in Botswana, but that was teacher training, so I haven't really talked about that as much. But again, I just loved being able to be in the sun all day, to be able to go for a swim in the afternoon, have a beer, watching the sun go down if you drink alcohol. There's so many joys and happy experiences working internationally. So just really think through your reasons about why you would want to make the move. And hey, if you weigh them all up and it's 50-50, then take the risk. Even if it's 30-70, maybe take the risk anyway. I remember when I went to Botswana, that was my first international job. And yeah, I had doubts. I was 30 by then. I wasn't even that young. But I had doubts. But I took the leap. I didn't even know where Botswana is at the time. I had to look on the map. Wow, it's a country of like barely over 2 million people at the time, ravaged by the HIV and AIDS virus. But it was an opportunity I just couldn't imagine I could have passed up and not looked back and thought what might have happened. So if you think like that, then go for it. And if you work in the international sector, let me know how you find it. Do you enjoy it? What are the joys? What are the challenges? Leave some comments. Post on my LinkedIn or on the website. Okay. Thank you so much for listening.